In the winter of 1898, on a plot of frozen earth, 12 miles east of Billings, Montana, August Kellner is nailing boards to the sky. That is what his neighbor Dolph Hodgen says when he rides past on his roan horse and squints up at the spectacle. August is balanced on a ladder that sways a little in the November wind, hammering fresh-cut pine. Planks to a frame, the frame arches over his existing barn. Roof like the ribcage of some enormous animal rising 4 feet above the old roof. It makes the barn look twice as tall and entirely ridiculous. Hodgen reins in his horse and watches for a moment. Then he shakes his head with the particular slowness of a man who has decided something without being asked. August. He calls out, "What in the name of God are you building up there?" August doesn't look down. He sets the nail, drives it 3 times, and only then glances over his shoulder protection. He says. Hodgen stares at him. Then he laughs, a short bark of a sound that carries across the frozen ground and rides on. August watches him go. He sets another nail. The neighbors have been watching August Kellner for 2 years now. He arrived in Yellowstone County with a wagon, a wife named Ilse, 4 children, and a set of radical ideas. He brought theories about cold weather and survival that nobody in the Montana Territory had ever heard of before. He'd come from the Carpathian highlands of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a place where winters were long, and people learned. They figured out how to keep animals alive when the temperature dropped past anything a sane man could measure. He spoke English with an accent that made some people smile, and others simply wait for him to finish. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the patient eyes of a man without expectations. He did not look like a fool that, if anything, made the neighbors more suspicious. He had paid $380 for this land. It had taken everything he and Ilse had saved in 4 years, plus a loan of $90 from a church elder in St. Paul who'd taken pity on them. The loan was due in March of 1899. 16 months away from the morning August 1st broke ground. If he couldn't pay, he lost the land, including the 6 cattle he'd bought in September, the 2 horses, and the 17 chickens that Ilse tended with a seriousness reserved for Sunday prayers. Cattle were the whole plan. Raise them through winter, sell in spring, pay the loan, and build from there. The math was thin, and the margin was nothing. 1 bad winter, 1 sick animal, and the structure collapsed. Not just the farm, everything. The cold could take it all. If the barn didn't hold the future itself. And in Montana in 1898, a bad winter was not a question of if, it was a question of when, and how bad, and whether you had prepared for a thing you could not imagine. August had not yet lived it, but he had read about it, and he had listened to the stories. It made him wake some nights in a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. The winter of 1886 had killed 60% of the cattle in Montana Territory. 60%. In a single season, he had sat in a library in St. Paul for 3 days, reading the reports, the surveys, the ledgers, the first-hand accounts from men who had ridden out in April to count their losses and come back. Silent ranchers who had owned 50 cattle went to nothing. Men who had built their lives on a single hard decade. They found their herds frozen solid in the draws, piled against wire fences like gray lumber. Some of them never recovered. Some of them left the territory entirely and never came back. August had no intention of leaving. He had come too far. But he also had no intention of doing what others did, building a standard timber frame barn, packing it with hay, and hoping the winter would be moderate. Hope was not a building material. He was building for a winter that the prairie had never seen. He had seen what happened when men confused hoping for something with having prepared for it. The problem, as August understood it from his grandfather, was not simply that barns got cold. The problem was how they lost heat, and specifically where a standard timber frame barn lost warmth through the roof. Heat rose, the animals generated it. The warm air lifted toward the ceiling and passed through into the sky. His grandfather had known something about this, had built accordingly. August had seen it in the old country. What August had seen was a barn with a second roof. The concept was simple enough that it sounded stupid. That is precisely why the neighbors dismissed it. You built a roof over your roof. You left a gap of 3 to 4 feet between the 2 surfaces, sealed at the gable, and small ventilation gaps at the ridge allowed moisture vapor to escape. The air trapped became an insulating layer. Still air, dead air that didn't move, didn't carry heat away. It didn't connect the warm inside surface with the bitter outside world. He was building a thermal vault. It sat between the 2 roofs like a Sleeping thing, a buffer, a zone of nothing that cold could not easily cross. August had watched his grandfather's barn hold 40 degrees on the inside, when it was 30 below outside 70 degrees. Of difference maintained by nothing more complicated than boards and geometry, and trapped air. He intends to do better. The outer frame is constructed from 1-inch pine boards spaced 2 inches apart. He shaped them himself over 3 weeks, working by lantern light after the children were asleep. Ilse watches from the doorway, carrying the arithmetic $90 owed, in 16 months 6 cattle to survive. The project costs them $23 in materials they can barely afford. It costs 6 weeks of extra work. She watches the money and the calendar simultaneously. She does not say a word against the project. August packs material that any neighbor would find strange: bundles of dry prairie grass, compressed 4 inches thick. He laid them overlapping like shingles, and then covered them with the outer boards. The grass is not insulation in any modern sense of the word, but it is what he has. Dry plant matter traps air in its fibers. His grandmother had packed it between the walls of the root cellar. It adds thermal resistance, its stubbornness against the passage of heat. August does not have the word, only understanding. He has also done something to the barn floor that nobody has seen yet, because it is underground. 3 weeks before the roof, August spent 6 days digging. He excavated the barn floor to 2 feet deep. The job left his back in such a state that Ilse rubbed tallow-laced ointment into it. Each evening he lined the pit with flat stones hauled by sledge from the creek bed chosen for flatness and density. He filled the pit back in with sand and packed earth over the stones, raked it smooth, and weighted the stones were thermal mass. Once the animals were inside, those rocks would slowly absorb that warmth. They would become batteries radiating heat back when the air temperature plummeted. During the long freezing prairie nights, during the coldest part of the night, when the animals were still, the temperature outside dropped to its lowest point. Those stones would release stored heat. Slowly and steadily, much like a cast-iron stove releases warmth after the fire dies. It was not dramatic, but at 30 below a few degrees meant the difference between life and death for animals. The neighbors had noticed the digging. It was hard to miss a man moving that much earth over 6 days. Reckon he's building a root cellar under his livestock. Hodgen told Frank Doyle one afternoon at the fence line, put vegetables under your cattle and the smell will ruin them by February. Hodgen said. Doyle nodded in agreement. Selma Brandt heard it differently. She ran the store with Carl, possessing a merchant's ear for precise details. Selma Brandt told 2 women at Sunday service that August Kellner moved from a cold country where people buried themselves. She smiled sympathetically, as if the cold had affected his mind. The story made people nod with comfortable certainty. The gossip grew. People whispered the floor rocks were there because August believed they held spirits to calm the animals. August listened to the rumors from the church elder's son, thanked the boy quietly, and went back to his work. November deepened, and the cold stayed. Ice formed in the water troughs and had to be broken with a pick. Cattle stood close in the barn, breathing white clouds. August hung thermometers inside the barn and outside the house twice daily. August recorded the temperatures in a small leather book he kept on his kitchen table by the lantern. The barn held 18 to 22 degrees, while it was 12 below outside. A gap of over 20 degrees better than an unmodified barn by 8 to 10 degrees, he estimated, but not yet what he needed for Montana. He climbs back up on the roof in early November to solve a problem he has identified through the numbers. The ventilation gaps at the ridge are too large. Cold air is finding its way in and sinking. He works on that roof for 4 hours in 15-mile-an-hour winds and 8 degrees below zero. He cuts small baffles from salvaged tin, remnants of a cracked water tank, fitting them at angles to block the wind. It requires him to take his mittens off to feel the gaps, the cold gripping his hands. Instantly, he is up there when Hodgen rides past again, shouting that his contraption won't make a lick of difference. August drives the last baffle into place, feeling the tin through hands. He can barely close. The Lord sends the cold. He calls back down. He don't say we can't think about it. Hodgen shakes his head slowly. Reckon you'll think yourself right into the grave, he says. Carl Brandt, hearing this exchange, repeated in his store, laughs so hard he has to set down his coffee. By Sunday, August's barn is the joke of the county. A structure that looks like God sneezed on it. Real winter is 6 weeks away. August knows this, remembering the way the cold worked on you. Over time, he remembers how the cold occupied the margins of everything, and how the barn temperature never quite recovered. Each successive night started colder, the deficit accumulating across weeks of relentless sunless January days, until the warmest part of a clear January afternoon was still 10 below zero. He remembers watching his breath. He remembers standing in the barn on a February morning, thinking this is not the worst of it. This is the practice. Every calculation and every board nailed in November was a rehearsal for the coming storm he had written to his older brother Benedict back in the Carpathians that winter, describing his plans, and the cold. The letter took 6 weeks to arrive, and 4 more for Benedict's reply to travel back across the ocean. Benedict's reply was characteristically brief, written in their native dialect, carrying the weight of ancient mountain-born wisdom. Translated, the message was, "You are doing the right things, but do not forget the floor. The floor is where the grandfather's knowledge starts. Stone holds what air cannot. August, read it 4 times. December arrives with cold that is serious but not catastrophic, a cold that tests rather than destroys. Temperatures run 15 to 25 below at night. The thermometer in the barn holds well above zero. He writes the numbers each morning and evening, inside temperature, outside temperature, and the difference. Ilse looks at the numbers but says nothing. She is a practical woman, waiting to see what they mean. The cattle are well. August has deliberately overfed them since October, building their heat-generating body mass generates heat and takes longer to deplete than a thin animal's reserves during the long freeze. Each of his 6 cattle is carrying 30 to 40 pounds more than they would on a normal autumn feeding schedule. The extra grain costs him $8 he could not entirely afford. He buys it anyway, prioritizing the animal's survival. He nailed a second layer of boards to the inside of the gable walls, leaving a 3-inch insulation gap. The walls now breathe no more than a sealed box from outside. The barn looks strange and overmade from inside. It is darker, and warmer drafts are the enemy. Moving cold air carries heat away rapidly. Moving cold air carries heat away 50 times faster than still air. The Carpathians had taught him this physics on the 14th of January, a Thursday. The cattle bunch in the afternoon, 2 hours before their normal time at 4:30. The temperature drops 11 degrees in 50 minutes. August closes the barn early. August double-checks the door latches and goes to tell Ilse the true storm has finally arrived. Ilse is already bringing wood, and he helps her stack it against the house wall. 4 days' worth. He feeds the cattle their largest evening ration, breaking the ice in the trough for all they can drink. He checks each gap in the barn, stuffing the worst ones with wool rags and straw to block drafts. He climbs once more to the outer roof in the last gray light and tests his tin baffles. He walks to the house, stamps the snow from his boots, and tells Ilse it is coming tonight. She puts water on for coffee and calls the children as the wind begins. As a low directional sound, the sound becomes pressure, a physical force pushing against the walls, making the house rafters tick and creak. Then the snow comes flying horizontal in winds. August estimates between 50 and 60 miles an hour. He checks the thermometer at the house as the temperature begins its final terrifying descent into the deep freeze at 7 in the evening. It reads 22 below at 9. The mercury has plunged to 38 below zero at 11. He opens the door a crack and holds the thermometer at arm's length. It reads 41 below. He pulls the thermometer inside. Standing with the house warmth at his back and the storm pressing on every surface, he goes to the barn every 4 hours, tying a rope from house to barn door. Through the freezing dark, he moves hand over hand through a cold that feels like substance. The 40 feet take 8 excruciating minutes. He cannot feel his face. By the time he finds the barn latch inside, the dense smell of animals hits him. He holds the lantern to the center post. Thermometer 4 above zero. The gap is 4 to 5 degrees. He checks each animal with his hands, feeling for the warmth of moving blood. The cattle are standing not tight, bunched in panic. They stand breathing slow white clouds. The horses are calm. August breaks the trough ice. He stays 20 minutes, then returns through the rope. And the dark, the blizzard screams against the barn's timber walls. At 2 in the morning, the wind yanks the thermometer from his hand. He watches it vanish into white nothing. He makes his way to the barn by rope, and count of steps, arrives at the latch, and enters. He holds his replacement thermometer to the center post for 2 minutes. 6 degrees above zero. Inside, the animals breathe The structure makes small sounds under load outside. He hears the storm sounding like something that wants to come in it. Does not come in. The floor stones are giving back heat slowly and steadily after hours of absorbing it. Stones give up what they hold only when pushed. They will not hold forever. Nothing holds forever. But they are holding tonight, and tonight is what matters. He checks each animal. They are all right. He thinks of his grandfather, who built the first double-roofed barn he had ever seen. A low mountain structure standing next to the old man at age 7, in weather cold enough to make the trees crack. The cold does not know patience. That is our advantage. August Kellner goes back to the house. The storm does not break. Noon on the second day reads 35 below zero. The wind does not decrease. Hodgen's barn is losing. August sees a lantern smear, moving frantically back and forth through the white. Nothing. The inside of Hodgen's standard barn built with board and batten siding, and no insulation, dropped to 18 below zero. His youngest heifer is dead by morning. The horses stand with eyes shut. Ice crystals groan on their lashes. Hodgen tries burning extra wood, but the heat rises through the single roof and vanishes before reaching the animals. He goes to Frank Doyle for help. Doyle's situation is worse. Both spend the day moving animals into corners. The Peterson family has lost 4 cattle. Their barn internal temperature plummeted to 22 below zero farther north. The Olson family loses their entire operation, and a horse. 7 animals gone in the relentless cold. A full season of income gone in 48 hours. August goes to his barn every 4 hours for 3 days. On the third day, the temperature hits 51 below zero. August reads his thermometer with the lantern held close 6 degrees above zero. The gap between inside and outside is 57 degrees. He writes it in the book. He feels a kind of quietness, not triumph or relief exactly, but something closer to confirmation. Truth, proven true. The storm breaks on the morning of the 4th day, the wind dropping from a scream to a moan. The temperature rises to 35 below zero, a world taking stock after extreme weather. August and Ilse walk out together and look at the farm. The outer roof has held 2 boards on the east face of split from the extreme contraction of the wood, a fact August had calculated they will need to be replaced. But the breach was not fatal. The tin baffles at the ridge remain intact. Snow drifted deep against the outer shell, turning the south side into a hill, providing an unintended insulating benefit. The house is intact. Inside the barn, every animal is alive. All 6 cattle, both horses and every chicken. Hodgen's barn has lost 3 cattle and 1 horse by the time the grim count is finally complete. The Peterson family has lost 7 of their 14 head. The Olson family has lost everything with 4 legs except a single elderly dog. Frank Doyle has 2 cattle showing signs of severe cold stress. 1 dies from complications. 3 weeks later, the county wakes up to count its losses, which are severe. The losses change the shape of the place. The banker rides out on the 2nd day. Making his circuit, the banker tells people later that the roads looked like a map of failure. Damaged farms carrying a visible silence. Carl Brandt hears the numbers from his customers. As they come into the store for supplies after the storm, he tallies the total loss in his head, realizing he has been wrong about something practical and vital. On the 8th day, he drives out to August's farm in his wagon with Selma sitting beside him. He stands looking at the barn, at the outer roof, at the shape of it against the winter sky. August comes out of the house. Brandt says, "I heard your cattle are all fine." His voice is careful. "All fine, August," says Brandt. Asks if he lost anything. August replies, "Simply nothing." Brandt nods, slowly looking at the outer roof again. "I'd like to understand how it works," he says. August shows him everything: the frame, the grass bundles packed in the gap, the tin baffles, and ventilation angles. He kneels in the barn dirt, drawing with his finger to show how thermal mass absorbs and releases heat steadily. He explains: still air versus moving air, the rate at which warmth crosses a dead air gap versus a board surface. Brandt listens with hands clasped behind him, asking precise questions, his merchant's mind calculating the labor and costs. "How much did all this cost you?" Brandt asks. $23 in materials. August says, "My own labor." Brandt is silent, thinking about the thousands of dollars in dead cattle lost across the county. "This week, I told people at church." "You weren't right in the head," Brandt says. "I heard that." August says quietly. Selma. Brandt climbs down from the wagon and looks inside at the calm cattle and the stone floor. She is quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she says, "for what I said." August looks at her. You were working with the information you had, August says, gently. So was I. He looks at Selma with empathy. Hodgen comes to the fence, too. Days earlier, arriving alone on his roan horse in the flat gray light, he sits his horse at the fence line and looks at August for a long time, his face weary. He has lost 3 cattle and a horse he has. Done the arithmetic of his spring and found it wanting your cattle made it, he says. Yes, August replies, standing steady in the middle of his yard. How warm did it get in there? 6 above 0 inside. August says 51 below outside. Hodgen takes his hat off. It is the gesture you make when you encounter something that requires respect. That's 57 degrees of difference, he says quietly. 57, August agrees. The cold air sits between them. Hodgen puts his hat back on. I'd like to see how you built it. He says, to show a fool you're not a fool. August says, you didn't know, now you do. He leads him toward the barn. He shows Hodgen the double roof, framing the grass insulation, the tin baffles, and the angle of the ventilation gaps. He kneels in the dirt and explains the stone floor drawing. Diagrams with a stick as Hodgen watches with the attention of a man, realizing that not knowing has cost him dearly. The loan is paid in March. A winter that should have erased them has instead rooted them to the earth. August Kellner stands in his yard looking at the barn that nailed boards to the sky. August sells 2 cattle in the spring market, both in prime condition, receiving a price that reflects the county's scarcity. He pays the $90 loan plus interest and has $23 left, which goes toward a new kitchen garden. He writes the final entry in the leather book. Winter closed, all animals well, floor intact, outer roof effective. He opens the 2nd volume on the 1st of November. That autumn he helps Hodgen build a double roof. The following autumn he helps the Peterson family. The autumn after that the Doyle family. The technique begins spreading. He draws the same diagrams each time in the dirt of each new barnyard, explaining the depth and placement. He explains the stone floor, the depth, the placement, and the weight of the stone that holds heat longest. He shows the tin baffles. He explains the air gap. The technique spreads farmer to farmer, fence line to fence line. Some men write back to their brothers and cousins in other counties, explaining what they have learned from August. The technique spreads the way useful things spread in communities that have been hurt badly enough to pay attention. Each new double-roofed barn becoming its own argument, its own small proof visible from the road. By 1903, there are 6 in the eastern part of Yellowstone County. By 1907, 14. By 1912, a cattleman from Wyoming asks about the strange barns, and a rancher explains it as tradition. August keeps the leather books. He fills 4, and then a 5th the numbers tell a consistent story. The gap holds the stone, gives back its heat. Still air does its quiet work. Animals that would die live. He does not become famous. He is a farmer with his wife Ilse and children who know he builds things knowing something true has weight, has consequence, the specific gravity of a life built on more than hope. Pieter asks him what he felt that night in the barn with 6 above inside and 51 below outside. August thinks about it for a long time. The memory of the storm returns in a vivid silent rush, long enough that Pieter begins to wonder if the question was wrong then. August says, I felt what a man feels when a thing he believed in turns out to be true. It is not joy exactly. It is something quieter, like the ground being solid under your feet after a long time of ice. Pieter writes this down outside the window. The November wind moves across the frozen field, and the double-roofed barn past the fence line, where Hodgen's own barn now wears the same strange doubled silhouette against the winter sky. Inside the barn, 6 cattle breathe. Their slow white breath, the numbers in the leather book, do not lie. The gap holds